Let's get started. First of all, I'd like to welcome Tina Fordham, who founded Fordham Global Foresight 2 years ago after a distinguished career in finance, where she was a trailblazer in geopolitical risk and its implications for business. And Martin Brush, our markets expert. Martin joins us today. Before he joined Fordham Global, his career encompassed running derivatives businesses for tier one banks before becoming the chief risk officer in investment banking. Few housekeeping points. We have 30 minutes for today's presentation. You can ask questions and comment directly in the chat, and only the panelists will see those questions. Tina and Martin will try and answer those and address those during the presentation, as well as the ones that you submitted when you registered. There will not be a live Q&A through this process. Now, our goal is to prepare your minds for the next quarter using our PQ, our political quotient approach to looking at geopolitical events, and try and link these insights with the implications for business and investment, and highlight new ways of looking at these forces that will help you as a decision maker. So moving ahead, we have some polling questions, which I'm going to try and get going for you, which you should be able to see on your screen. I'm just relaunching this right now. Here we are. What we're going to do is we're going to lead through these questions one by one. So you should be able to see those. Let's start with this first true or false question. Will it be a better year for business and the economy than 2023? Let us know what you think. Are we feeling positive about business and economies compared to last year, or pessimistic? Our next question, your thoughts on the geopolitical outlook for the year. Are you more or less concerned than last year? And our final question, true or false, do you think Trump will win the US elections or not?
Well, let's see the results.
You're still all voting furiously, so
don't be shy, it's anonymized.
Don't be shy. I'm going to end the poll in a couple of seconds' time. Okay, let's see where we end up. Oh, still a few last minute ones coming in there. I shall end the poll now. Fantastic. And I shall share those results with you. Some interesting responses. Fantastic. Okay.
Okay. Well, we got the people worried about geopolitics on the line, unsurprisingly.
Fantastic. That's excellent news. Okay. So first up, let's dive straight in. Tina, can you get us started with the political signposts that we need to be aware of during this second quarter of the year, please?
Yes, thanks, Jamie, and thanks everybody for joining. Starting off with the signposts, these are the known knowns, as our old friend Donald Rumsfeld described them. And this is really the easy part. These are the things that we know are going to happen in the next quarter. Everyone is prepared for the fact that this is an extraordinary year for elections. We've got a couple of big ones coming up in May, especially in terms of population. For India, we don't expect surprises. Modi is certain to win, and it's really a question of the margin and what he does with his boost at the polls. One of the things that we're watching is Democratic backsliding, as we call it in political scientist-ese, or consolidation of power, crackdowns on the media, and everything else. But of course, India, typically referred to as the world's largest democracy. South Africa will also go to the polls. Again, the long-standing ruling ANC almost certainly headed for victory, but there with more challenges from new parties, and we're going to look for the margin that the ANC eventually ends up with. For June, I think most of the clients who will have joined this call today, the European parliamentary elections are an important barometer for typically for fringe parties trying out selling their wares. And EU fringe parties have a new proposition these days. It's typically combining anti-green, anti-ESG policies and anti-immigration. It's not so much Eurosceptic anymore. It doesn't move the needle. It doesn't prompt a market reaction. But in terms of the business and regulatory implications, it is definitely one to watch. Usually, business tends to be more concerned about left-wing populist parties. In this case, we should be preparing for a pretty strong performance from right-wing populist parties. Jamie.
Do you see any non-election political signposts that you've been tracking for clients?
Yes, in an environment of heightened conflict where we are now, open warfare, anniversaries and key dates often coincide, unfortunately, with terrorist attacks or with sort of messages being sent. And so with that in mind, May 9th for Russia is always a big holiday. It's VE Day, typically observed in Moscow with tanks in the streets and military prowess. I would be looking for a possible intensification on attacks in Ukraine. The NATO summit will take place July 9th in Washington, D.C. Again, sending messages during a time of war is something that's possible. Not only does Russia do this, so does ISIS. Paris Olympics over the summer will be a security matter, among other things, and the US political party conventions. I think given what we're seeing in the US on college campuses, I suspect there are going to be some fireworks, particularly at the Democratic Party conference. Jamie.
Okay, so let's move on from the signposts in the second quarter to what we're watching on our Navigator watch list. Now, this watch list that we put together, it's part of the digital playbook that we produce in collaboration with the London Stock Exchange and update monthly. What's the thinking that goes into this analysis, Tina?
Well, I believe this is the only effort of its kind, first of all. What we're doing here is plotting the risks that we assess to be most likely to move markets along this trajectory, priced in to systemic shock. North Korea firing off ballistic missiles is something that happens periodically, hasn't moved markets since about 2006. But the other three risk factors that we've highlighted here are all quite significant. I think markets have gotten used to them. It's not surprising maybe at this point to see them there, but each of them have the potential to re-escalate or move down an unconventional trajectory. And it's important just to realize, with Russia as a nuclear power having threatened to use its nuclear weapons, it is likely saber rattling, but there's a non-zero probability of unconventional warfare breaking out. And so with that in mind, we're focusing at this point in the discussion on the risks that are in plain sight and where there might be disconnects between the way market participants view them and the way us geopolitical types do. Jamie.
Now, just to move on from there, at the heart of the current thinking that's driving Navigator is this idea of the new geopolitical risk supercycle. Can you talk us through this and how it works?
Yes, of course. If you've been receiving our newsletter content or following what we do, you know that I put out this thesis on the new geopolitical risk supercycle almost a year ago now. So in other words, before the uptick in risk in the Middle East. Let me say at this point, we haven't had any questions come in through the Q&A. Please feel free to send them as we go along and give us your feedback. I'm sorry that I can't see you, but hello to everyone. Here's the thinking on the geopolitical risk supercycle. This is our term. Supercycle is typically used in a market context talking about commodities, but it's a term from astronomy and it refers to expansion. One of the things that I've been fighting against, pushing against for my 25 years in this area, looking at geopolitics and markets, is the tendency that investors have to look at geopolitical risks as episodic, and as occurring in hotspots. In other words, without interlinkages. In this graphic, we break down the difference between the risk drivers, the disruptions, which is where we actually see them register in markets or not, the buffers and countervailing forces. This is empirically driven. This is part of our methodological approach. Again, part of what makes what we're doing unique. However you slice it, there has been a significant increase in the drivers of geopolitical risk. Let's take conflicts. These are tracked by the International Crisis Group, and the number, the frequency, the duration, the lethality of conflicts has been on the rise since about 2012. Whether that is structural or cyclical is kind of up in the air, but it's not your imagination. There are more conflicts. Another driver of risk is climate change. Not only does it cause climate-related disruptions, it also increases the likelihood of conflicts. More heat also means increases in crime, by the way, and immigration. So these are the things that can be generated, and if they are not addressed or mitigated by the buffers and countervailing forces, that means quantitative easing, diplomacy, in not that long ago, action from the UN or global powers coming together. Deterrence theory is another, buffer or countervailing force. Without that, we get the disruptions. So guess what? We are now in a place where we're getting more disruptions, and our expectation, based on the fact that we don't see a reason for a change in trend, an outbreak of brotherly love, for example, or a huge boom to the global economy that will change the outlook, or changes in technology that will mean an end to climate change. More disruptions, more frequent, and when the system is brittle, more things can break through. Jamie.
Let's go into a bit more detail on that disruption of the natural order. Can you dig in a little bit further, Tina?
Yeah, I mean, the international order is a perfect example of the kind of thing that it is impossible to assess through any kind of traditional market lens. But again, international relations, political science types like to talk about. When we do talk about it in a business context, it's normally in terms of the rise of the BRICS, BRICS versus the G7, or these kinds of constructs. But I think at this point, everyone understands that the Pax Americana, the post-Cold War period, US as the sole superpower, is finished, but it hasn't really been replaced by another power construct. And this period of disequilibrium is going to last for quite a while. One of the reasons why we're seeing more conflicts and why there are more great powers pursuing them is clearly an attempt to influence this rebalancing of power. We now have, and I don't normally quote Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, but he has echoed US intelligence on this. We now have China supplying Russia's war in Ukraine, Iran also helping, North Korea providing weapons. This is significant stuff, and it's open in a way that we haven't seen before. Now, for the time that most of us have been in our professional sphere, the idea that it was the economy stupid has prevailed. That was something James Carville said back in the Clinton era. Well, it's now national security stupid. And this is super complicated given that we are in a slow or low growth environment, the state of public debt burdens, and the fact that paying for defense is not really a vote getter at the polls. The public doesn't want to spend on something that is already priced in, to use our language. And so that is going to lead to some challenges. Jamie.
I'd be quite interested in taking the spotlight off geopolitics and maybe starting to think about some of the economic and financial implications of what you're talking about, Tina. Maybe Martin, would you be happy to sort of pick that up?
Sure. I think building on some of Tina's points, certainly the comments by Sunak recently and others are underlining the fact that Western governments are going to have to face a very cold and uncomfortable truth, that they're going to have to spend significantly more money on arms and defending themselves. The plethora of elections, as Tina's already highlighted, These things are not vote winners, but it doesn't make them go away. The conflict in Ukraine has underlined a couple of things. First of all, that drone technology, being very, very cheap, is incredibly effective. The conflict, the attack by Iran on Israel, again, another thing that's challenging military orthodoxies. It's very, very cheap to launch an attack, to be an aggressor, but it's actually very expensive to defend against it. In our opinion, this asymmetry of costs versus attack versus defense is an uncomfortable truth, and it's a risk in plain sight. We actually believe that this will, through the amount of money it's going to take, put a significant amount of pressure upwards on rates. We also expect, finally, that markets are going to remember the adage, and Tina will be able to tell you who said this, but I think it's Disraeli, is that 10 days are a long time in politics. When you're sitting trying to make decisions about 10-year or 5-year bonds and the world is bouncing around, it's hard. So the actual investment criteria are much more complicated than we're all used to. In summary, I would counsel risk managers as follows. We should not only be considering higher rates for longer, but we should also test our assumptions about yield curve steepening and credit spread widening for the foreseeable future. Jamie.
Well, on that optimistic note, we're going to go straight into even worse news, our danger zone. Tina, if we bring all these threads together, it's a pretty volatile place. How do you reconcile it?
Well, we're talking about a danger zone period between now and US elections in November, if not beyond. I really want to reinforce, by the way, Martin's points. Martin flagged the risk of 0 rate cuts before we started hearing it from Jerome Powell. So what he has to say carries a lot of weight. And of course, geopolitics is a factor feeding into the uncertainty about inflation, about rate cuts, and everything else. So at the risk of raining on the optimism about the business environment, although to be fair, we did ask if people thought it was better this year than last year. So I think it's fair enough. If you're in business, you have to be optimistic, but I think we need to be prepared for a pretty fraught period between now and November. I already flagged some of the signposts that we're watching, but to bring it down to specifics, if the parties that are involved in a conflict or non-state actors, opportunistic or challenger actors, are going to want to take advantage of this period to change the facts on the ground, increase their negotiating leverage when there is time for diplomacy. This is especially true between Russia and Ukraine, but it's certainly true in the Middle East as well, where the below radar actions to undermine Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, what the Houthi rebels have been doing in the Red Sea, which has ended up blocking traffic. As long as the conflicts continue, and we're going to touch on each of those 3 again, the Middle East, South China Sea, and Russia, the objective is going to be to enhance your gains so that you can keep as many of them as possible when and if it comes time to negotiate. This is also true about the rebalancing of the international system. There is less fear of a US response right now. And if anything, there's a great temptation to test the waters and to see if NATO is a paper tiger, on the one hand, and if the US security guarantees in Asia are in name only. Jamie.
Tina, just on those 3 points, and we are certainly, the clock is ticking. So I wondered if we could take those 3 areas, the Middle East, the South China Sea, and Russia, and just quickly canter through a minute on each one of those, if that's possible.
Yes, I will try to do that. I see we have a question about the early signs to look for in case of a relapse or re-escalation in the Middle East. I mean, what we have at the moment is a pause. Markets have breathed a sigh of relief, quite rightly, but let's take a moment to appreciate what actually happened. Both sides upped the ante significantly by firing directly into each other's territory, meaning Iran and Israel. It is true that Iran does not want to go to war, especially one that involves the United States. That does not mean that Iran wants peace, and let's understand that. There is an active and long-standing conflict going on, and when Israel was able to fire and target the radar facility adjacent to the Natanz nuclear site, that was a message, and the message was, we can blow up these facilities whenever we want. Now, most war game estimates think that that would involve mass casualties, and these facilities are buried deep inside mountains and everything else. But there is nothing like an existential conflict that involves two leaders of weak leaders in two countries. The mullahs in Tehran have been subject to protests. Benjamin Netanyahu is unpopular, hasn't brought the hostages home, which is what most Israeli people want. The risk that this conflict re-escalates, to my mind, is high because it hasn't really been resolved. Israel hasn't achieved its objectives, and I think we should, to the question of what to watch for next, a Rafah offensive, which seems in fact to be starting. Jamie.
And can we turn our attention to South China? Tina, you've written about the Second Thomas Shoal. What's happening there? Why is this important?
Yes, a lot of the the scenes of global conflict seem to involve kind of outcroppings of rock. And this is a surprising phenomenon for market participants who, routinely ask me things like, no, surely no one's going to go to war over territory. Well, in fact, 85% of all of the wars in human history have been about territory, including strategically placed outcroppings of rock, like the Second Thomas Shoal. To make a long story short, the kind of below radar developments that you might not be paying attention to are the fact that the Chinese Navy are effectively blockading the Philippines naval vessel from being resupplied. That means sailors aren't getting food and water. Now, why do that? Because we believe in our world, in finance, rational actors act in their rational self-interest. It connects back to the point I made about testing how serious the US is about its treaty guarantees, because if the US does not defend sites of friction like the Second Thomas Shoal, then how valid is it? And there is nothing that Beijing and Moscow would like more than to be able to say, that security guarantee you have, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So this kind of testing is serious. And in the case of the Second Thomas Shoal, it has prompted a US military response. Jamie.
That's a good segue into our final two points here on the Kremlin and Washington.
Yes, a couple of points there. My experience in Russia goes back a very long way, as a lot of you know. The question I get asked most often about Russia and Ukraine is, how does this end? And that's been extremely difficult to answer. But we have a major development, obviously, with the US House of Representatives finally approving a really whacking great number when it comes to aid to Ukraine, around 60 billion, as well as military aid to Taiwan and to Israel, involving what appears to be a kind of Damascene conversion from US House Speaker Mike Johnson. That's an interesting backstory in itself. So when will the rubber hit the road? I think the White House must have leaked the fact that they already secretly sent long-range ballistic missiles to Ukraine last month. This means Ukraine can reach into Crimea. They have a range of about 190 miles. Recall that Ukraine has also been targeting Russian oil production facilities, domestic oil production facilities. This is all going to pick up. So the military aid will start right away. Whether it's enough for Ukraine to win is unknowable. But the bottom line is that neither side is ready to start negotiating. I think that this is the time when the rubber really will hit the road in the conflict, which has already seen staggeringly high number of casualties.
And now let's just flip that lens back to the US. What could possibly go wrong, Tina?
It's a long list, and again, these are the kinds of developments which are below radar for market participants. If you see something coming across your Bloomberg ticker that there's been a sixth coup in West Africa, that's not the kind of thing that moves markets. But again, if you put all of the data points together, you've got the Wagner Group involved in those coups, spreading its influence all across Africa, plus stirring up tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, massive dis and misinformation campaigns. I think the world has been very slow to wake up to how Russian interference is affecting us. We will see interference in elections, not only from Russia, but also from North Korea, Iran, China, and many others. But Russia as a disruptive power is not going anywhere. Back to you, Jamie.
Well, this leads us into our final stretch, which is really to start thinking about the silver linings, the new opportunities, wishful thinking, volatility, wild cards. This lets us dig into some broader thoughts, but also some of your questions. Maybe Tina, if you start and kick us off here.
I'm looking at these wonderful questions that have been sent through, and they're very sophisticated and long. And our idea was to have this short, targeted conversation. But these are great questions. Martin, have a look, and we'll try to come back to you. If you're anonymous, I can't come back to you, but we'll try to come back to you afterwards on these, because I love the questions. These are really some interesting thinking. When it comes to the US, I mean, I can't walk into a room these days without somebody kind of doorstepping me and saying, who's going to win? You haven't seen, if you think about it, you haven't seen any election prognosticators, and I am not an election prognosticator, making a call on these elections. Why? Have a look at this slide at the number of pretty kooky variables. That's my technical description. There is more variability possible in the scenarios. We have two candidates that 62% of Americans don't want either back in the White House, and yet those are their choices. We have an economy in the United States where enviable rates of growth for all of us here in the anemic old continent. Unemployment is low, but a significant proportion of Americans think that the economy is terrible. Not only is that remarkable, but it should be deeply worrying to all of us that the price of chicken McNuggets may end up being the determining factor in the way that Americans vote. I'm being a bit facetious, but inflation tends to be something that governments are blamed for, whereas investment gains are due to one's own sheer brilliance. Taking our poll and what I've been hearing from our clients, it seems to me that most people in the UK and Europe have already decided that Trump will win. It puts your mind at ease at all. I would like to say that it is way too early to make that assessment. Early polls have very limited predictive power. Of course, Trump is testifying in a criminal trial right now. You have seen him in the courtroom on many other occasions. Those have been civil trials, and it's estimated that around 5% of voters who say they would vote for Trump would not vote for him in the event that he had a criminal conviction. 5% in this environment is a lot. Jamie.
So I'm going to hop on. We're on our silver linings here. We've got 3 questions that you've sent in. I'm going to see if we can get them in. Tina, you get one of them. Martin, you get the other one. Martin, I'm going to go to you first of all. What's the risk posed by overgrowing corporate and public debt at the moment, this big burden? What do you think about that?
Quite simply, Jamie, thanks for the question, by the way, whoever sent it in. I think we need to remember a couple of things, and these numbers are in the public domain, so I'm not telling anybody anything that a good economist couldn't tell you. The size of the US debt, federal debt, is about $34 trillion, 9 of which will need to be refinanced sometime in 2004. There's a further $2 trillion of corporate debt, again, which needs to be refinanced in 2004. These things represent something which is a large and very, the bond markets work well until they don't. Bond markets tend to try to issue paper when market conditions are good. Back to my earlier point about 10 days is a long time in politics. bumpy markets, I think, are going to be a feature that we're all going to have to get used to. I would leave everybody with a reminder of how compressed risk premia are. In 2015, Brazil, as a country, its 10-year debt was 15 percentage points over US Treasuries. Today, it's about 7. Jamie.
Thank you. Tina, I'm going to pass on to you to wrap up. We're now on our final slide. I'm conscious that we've just hit our time, but there's just enough time for Tina to play us out.
Well, you know, again, phenomenal questions, and you're all going to be receiving an email into your inboxes shortly with your feedback. If you'd like to add your question there in the comments, we'll try to come back to you, but it's great to see this engagement. I do want to pick up one of the more surprising questions that came in earlier before we started, and this was some news reports suggesting that the US elections might be canceled. This really got my attention. No US election has ever been canceled. There's no provision for it in the American Constitution. But once these kinds of stories get some traction in the press, then of course everybody feels like they need to have an answer. So I would, you know, dismiss this concern as you know, being extremely unlikely. In case of a national emergency of some kind, it's possible to imagine, you know, really imagine elections being postponed, but there's no provision in the Constitution. What there is a provision for is the sitting head of state needs to vacate the White House by Inauguration Day, which is January 20th. So we're now just 2 minutes past our 30 minutes. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation. Obviously, we've touched on a lot of issues very quickly. This has been a free webinar. We are going to move with clients to longer and more comprehensive, more interactive, but you do need to sign up and become a client in order to be able to do that. So give us your feedback. Let us know what you think. In addition to our written content, we have the free newsletter and the Navigator, which comes out about once a month. We do board briefings and one-to-one briefings. If your business is exposed in any of these areas, or you want to work on developing the PQ, political quotient of your board and your leadership team, contact us, and we are very happy to help.
Thanks so much. See you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.